Next on Married People's Business,
Juneteenth. Why are we celebrating?
we'll give you a history of the holiday and why it is so important for our communities that we celebrate it.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Married People's Business. And I am one of your co-hosts, Michael Tolbert, and I'm here with my beautiful co-host,
Shalise Tolbert. Thank you so very much.
Oh, of course. I got to butter your buns when I can. And, we married, so I can say buns because we married. So that means it's legal, y'all.
All righty then.
This podcast highlights successful married couples in business and their road to success, as well as other successful business partners and collaborators. But that's not all we do. We discuss helpful tips that impact business, that impacts partnerships and collaborations, and other timely topics.
Yes.
And we have a timely topic for you today.
Yes.
You want to introduce it?
Yes. As we approach a newly signed federal holiday, Juneteenth. Juneteenth is actually June 19th, and it's been recognized, but now it is a federal holiday that is recognized, I believe, the third Monday of June now. So this year, it is federally recognized on June 20th, which is the Monday coming up.
And I am so excited for this holiday because it means so much for African American people. And, Juneteenth and everything that stands for has impacted so many different institutions across African American life. And, this is why we wanted to do this podcast, particularly to talk about Juneteenth, but really to delve into the concept of why are we celebrating Juneteenth? And really, should we be celebrating Juneteenth with all the things that are going on in our own community that impact us? So
Right. So you wanna talk a little bit about the history of Juneteenth, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea for us to jump into because some of the people that are watching and listening might not know what Juneteenth is. You've given a good cursory overview of the fact that it is a national holiday, but why is it a national holiday? And the reason that is because I'll give you a quick history lesson. So January 1st, 1863, our great President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And what that proclamation did was that it freed slaves. And there's a misconception about the Emancipation Proclamation. People think that, that was the document that freed slaves completely, but that's not completely accurate. What the Emancipation Proclamation did was it freed slaves in, I believe the proclamation said, rebellious states,
Right.
which essentially meant Confederate states. And the Emancipation Proclamation was really more of a strategic military move by President Lincoln at the time to weaken what was a strong slave economy. And that's basically how the Southern states funded the Civil War.
I know this totally excites you because you're a history guy.
I am a history
Lincoln
guy.
was a lawyer.
And he was a lawyer.
And
from the Midwest.
Right.
From the Midwest.
Illinois.
So,
You're totally lighting up as you're talking about.
Well, I like this type of stuff. But that little nuance, I think, is missed on folks. So people think that, hey, once Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation, he gets a lot of credit for that. And although it was a step to the freedom for African Americans and Africans that were enslaved at the time, it did not completely free us.
Right. So I think what you're leading up to is that what did completely free slaves, I should say, was the 13th Amendment that was passed 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation.
That's correct. Congress passed it, I believe, January 31st, 1865. It was ratified on December 6th.
Right.
1865, and the 13th Amendment completely abolished slavery. But there are some things that happened a little bit before that, and that brings us to what this show is about, which is Juneteenth.
Right.
So when the Emancipation Proclamation, was signed and was read all across the country, particularly in warring rebellious states, they didn't have Facebook in 1800. They didn't have Instagram. They didn't have all of these fancy things that we use today to instantly. Could you imagine what Lincoln, how cool it would have been for Lincoln when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation? He could have sent the text to all the southern states saying, you know what, all these black folks are free now, so you got to let them go. You know, that would have been nice.
It would have been. He could have did a tweet.
He could have done everywhere. A tweet, and that would have helped our good brothers and sisters in Galveston, Texas. But since we did not have Facebook and Instagram and text messages, the good people in Galveston, Texas, on June 19th, 1865, that is how long it took for them to get the news. And there's some fighting about how that actually happened, whether or not the folks, the slaveholders in Galveston, Texas, actually knew about the Emancipation Proclamation. Some people say that it took a long time for that message to be delivered. I'm a firm believer it don't take no damn 2 years for we are free to be delivered to the southern states, particularly Galveston, Texas. But that's a whole nother issue. But there are reasons why it took so long. You know, for economic reasons, slaveholders still wanted to take hold of that slave labor and just did not want to free folks. And there was the timing of it all. It did take a little bit of time for things to travel back in the 1800s.
Yeah, you know, I understand that. But we even had the 13th Amendment being passed before they found out.
Well, not completely. I think the 13th Amendment occurred.
I thought it was January of 1865, and we're talking about Juneteenth being June of 1865.
Right. Yeah, you're right. The timing was right.
Timing,
that's right.
You know, you get a whole amendment to the Constitution before the people in Galveston want to tell the African Americans that they have enslaved that, oh, by the way, you've been free for 2 years.
Well, yeah, and I think, you know, not to digress on this spot, because I think we can all infer as educated folks that there are a lot of reasons why the good folks in Galveston, Texas, decided to delay letting all of their free labor know that they were free. And I think we are smart enough to know why that delay happened. Absolutely. But timing, economic pressures, all the things kept that from happening. But, you know, good thing, June 19th, 1865 occurred. Gordon Granger got to Galveston, Texas, and he read General Order Number 3, which essentially told the slaves in Galveston, Texas, that the Emancipation Proclamation had passed and they are no longer slave labor and they were free. And that they were late. What I thought was fascinating about this story, too, is that the message that was delivered was that you're no longer essentially a slave, and I'm paraphrasing this, y'all. So you're no longer a slave, but your relationship is now more of an employer-employee relationship. So instantly, you know, folks that were working and tending fields were now, quote unquote, employees of these slaveholders. And you know, there's a whole bunch of reasons why that didn't work initially, but that's the history of Juneteenth. And as Shalise alluded to, it was made a national federal holiday by Joe Biden in June of 2021, and it's recognized by some as the second Independence Day. And you might hear that from time to time. People refer to it as that. So that's the backdrop between Juneteenth.
Right. So the one thing, though, that I want to add to that is that Juneteenth has been recognized for years.
That's correct.
Making it a federal holiday is what President Biden did in 2021. That was the first federal holiday.
That's correct. That's correct. And one of the things that, and like you said, it's been celebrated, and even once the General Order 3 was read by the general, from that point in time moving forward, African Americans were very happy in that area that they were free, and of course they would be, and they began to do all kind of celebrations. So from that point in time, from 1865 all the way into present day, you had folks that were celebrating in their own different ways. So you had church gatherings, you had cookouts, you had barbecues, and you had all of these celebrations that differed depending on where you were in the country in terms of customs and how folks decided to celebrate it. And it's really not one way to celebrate it.
Right.
But the one thing that I do think should be uniform is the fact as to what are we celebrating and why And I think over the years that has really been missed, in my opinion.
I would say, I would agree with you to a certain extent. Why are we celebrating? Well, of course, we're celebrating freedom, but what comes from that? What are we doing in our communities to exhibit that? What are we doing to indicate in our communities, okay, we've got this freedom, we're celebrating something. Are we just having another cookout and a day off? I mean, what are we doing? Are we reflecting on what this means to our communities? This was a time where blacks were reestablishing themselves.
Post-Reconstruction.
Absolutely. They had to come together because there was still racism that was being dealt with, and classism, and the thought of the black Americans, the African Americans, still by the Confederate States being thought of as not citizens.
And that's true. And one of the things that I thought was very important for us to talk about this topic on Married People's Business is because the thing that we focus on this podcast and that we always wanted to talk about is collaboration and partnership, healthy collaboration and healthy partnerships amongst people. And this, before Juneteenth, before the Emancipation Proclamation, before the 13th Amendment, you really had institutional barriers to those partnerships in a certain segment of our society, particularly black people. So, when you're in slavery, you're not encouraged to come together and to unify.
Right.
And even after Juneteenth, I think the biggest misconception is that when the Emancipation Proclamation was read, when General Order was read, when the 13th Amendment was passed, and later on you had the 14th and the 15th Amendment that secured our right to vote and our freedoms to be other freedoms that flow from those amendments. People, those rights did not just automatically secure. You had a post-Reconstruction period where people intentionally tried to stop collaboration and partnerships of a specific segment of our population, i.e. African Americans. And you still see vestiges of it today. Our lack of institutions in our communities, our lack of marriage, which we're going to talk about a little bit. All of that springs from old relics of the institution of slavery and the relics that were put in place after Juneteenth and during that post-Reconstructionist period.
Right, and I would imagine that the thought was hard to change. It was hard on both sides because you're talking about African Americans that had not known how to collaborate with one another.
Yes.
Because of what was put in their mind as to what would happen to them if they did. So
Right.
Now we are at a point where we're celebrating the day that we're free to do this. And we're celebrating an event. So what are we doing in our communities? Togetherness. What are we doing to come together as African Americans to continue to flourish and work with one another in a positive way?
Well, that's the problem, and that's sort of the criticism that I have of Juneteenth, because I think some people, just like Martin Luther King Day, they take it as a day off. They take it as a day to cook, barbecue, and to really relax, when really we have a lot of work to do in our communities, and that day should be used as a planning stage to attack some of the problems that existed way back then. When General Order 3 was read, at that time you had laws that were in place by Southern whites that prohibited congregation in public places, meaning that you could not get together and talk to your fellow black brother or your fellow black sister, which means that you dang sure weren't getting together to start a business.
And I get what you're saying to a certain degree, but I also think that the celebrations should include things like highlighting businesses.
Yes.
Highlighting, the family unit, the black family unit. So to have those types of celebrations, not just, a cookout, of course, but, to highlight the businesses in the communities so that they are continuously recognized and we can continue to support them and support one another. I think that's one of the things that a lot of the celebrations may do.
I think it does, but I don't think it goes far enough. And if you go all the way back to after Juneteenth, after General Order 3 was read, you had institutions and barriers put in place to even stop African Americans from even celebrating Juneteenth. And I believe there was a stat that I read in 1872. You had free black people that got together, very influential black people during that time. They got together in about, I think it was 1872, where they actually bought for $1,000 a plot of land so that they could actually celebrate Juneteenth. And I think that actually that structure is still in existence in Houston, Texas. I think it's called Emancipation Park.
That's Emancipation Park, I believe.
Yeah, and I think those are some of the stories that are not told about our people. And I think that if we can morph back to 1872 when they scrounged up their money to buy that strip of land so that they could celebrate Juneteenth, I guarantee you it wasn't solely just to cook out and to relax. It was a time to reflect on the hard times and the hardships that all of their ancestors and that a lot of those folks went through to get to that point, and to collaborate in the partnership and create partnerships so that they can move on. And that's a story in of itself. Do you realize the partnerships and the collaboration that had to take place for freed African slaves to be able to have the wherewithal to generate $1,000 in 1872 to buy a tract of land? It was, in some places, it was even illegal for slaves to own property or to do any of those things, but they got together, pulled together $1,000 and bought a tract of land that still technically is in existence today. Fascinating.
Well, you know what? I think that it is fascinating, especially for that time, but I think it was something that was inherent in them because they had no choice. They weren't depending on the Southern whites anymore because their labor was not looked at the same way. So they had to figure something out. So now, okay, we've got to start working together, which is, brings me back to today. So we've got to continue to work together. You pointed out that this should be a time of reflection. Absolutely. Reflect on what we just talked about, that point right there. They had the community sense to come together to say, we're going to build something. We're going to collaborate and put our money together so that we can have something that we can call ours.
Yeah, and I think you can have a balance. You can have fun and games, but I still think there has to be a very strategic component to it that focuses on African Americans really understanding Juneteenth and really coming together to plan how to strategize, how to partner, and how to dig their communities out of some very deep holes. Because right now, statistically, if you look at, when me and you talk, I always talk about the three stools, the three-legged stool, and that is that's wealth, that's marriage, and that's love. Or no, it's wealth, marriage, and business is the three-legged stool that I always talk about. Those are the key things that you need for a healthy, vibrant community. And if you look at the black community, we are lacking in all of those. The wealth gap is abysmal. Between the wealth gap between whites and blacks is dismal. You have problems in our marriages. We're not marrying at the same rate as other groups are marrying. And we're not creating businesses to employ our own people. So that three-legged stool is not working in our communities. And those things are what have to be focused on when we're looking and celebrating Juneteenth and really strategizing how to take our communities back.
So basically what I'm hearing you say is that, and it doesn't happen just on one day.
That's true.
It's you're saying understand what Juneteenth means in the sense of what comes with it. What comes with it is planning to come together, planning to support our businesses, planning to create new businesses, planning to allow the individuals in our communities to understand that we have to come together in order to sustain.
That's true. And see, this is some of the things that if you research Juneteenth and you look at what happened after Juneteenth, particularly in Galveston, Texas, you had blacks, freed slaves that were dying in sporadic ways. for not tipping your hat to a white man, not going on the other side of the street when a white man is walking on that same side of the street, trying to vote. Some of the things that we take for granted today, we were being killed for. You had the Ku Klux Klan, you had the White League, you had the Knights of White Camellia. You had groups that were strategically formed to stop African American progress and movement and collaboration and partnerships. Today, we have ourselves. We're killing each other at alarming rates. We are not starting businesses in our communities. And we don't necessarily embrace our history in a way that sparks us into action. So I know I'm on a soapbox, but I think that is something that's near and dear to my heart, as you know. And I view Juneteenth every year as another missed opportunity for us to really reflect on some of the problems that we have in the community and really partner and collaborate to get out of them.
Well, I don't know that I would say to reflect on the problems on just that one day. I think it has to start before that. So, and it doesn't stop at that point. But to me, Juneteenth is to highlight the positivity that comes from the strategy for attacking those problems.
Yeah, and me being a critic and me really wanting to delve into that, what are the positives that have come out of collaboration in our communities? So if you look at 1866, this is a very important fact. You look at in 1863, Black Americans, we owned roughly 1/2 of 1% of the nation's wealth. That was our wealth. That would have been when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. Today, our wealth is what? 1.5% of 1% of the nation's wealth. 1.5%.
It's 1.5%.
Right, 1.5%.
So the original statute said it was
a half of 1%.
So 0.5%
of the nation's wealth.
So it's gone up 1%.
Yes.
That's it.
So what progress are you celebrating? You see what I'm saying? So that's my point is we haven't moved. The needle hasn't moved since 1863, since the General Order 3 was read at Galveston, Texas. It hasn't moved. Our position is the same as it was a million years ago. So the celebrations need to be celebrations, but they need to be targeting how to move the needle in a positive direction because we haven't moved anywhere.
Now, I would wonder, and I don't know if you have this information, but I would wonder how that statistic looked during the times of, I would say, probably after, maybe a decade or two after the Depression and into the Civil Rights Movement. I wonder if how that statistic moved in the sense of, was it a fast progression and then it just steadied off up, because I think about that time being a time where we were definitely self-sustaining in our communities. We definitely had our doctors, our lawyers, our professionals, our accountants in our own communities. And it makes me think of, oh gosh, now it just slipped my mind. In Oklahoma.
The Black Wall Street.
Black Wall Street. That's what I was trying to think of. It makes me think of that because, if I'm not mistaken, that was in the 20s. And so during the time that happened, you've got self-sustaining communities of Black professionals, of Black store owners, restaurant owners, and we're constantly, the dollar probably circulated in that Black community several times more than what it is now.
Oh, of course.
So I would wonder how that statistic changed and where did it level off, even though I still don't like that it's only 1% in over 100 years that it increased.
But that's the problem, and what you just highlighted was the problem that I see in our community is the mirage. So we see individual success as truly moving the needle, when really it's not individual success that moves the needle, it's collective success. So Tulsa, Oklahoma, I mean, we got the picture in the back of us because that's something that you and I know about and study, but that's one community. And when we did come together and collaborate in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Black Wall Street, we know the history there. They burned it down. And that's really what we need to focus. Why are people so threatened when people, particularly African American people, come together and partner and collaborate? And the reason that is because I think other groups understand the power and the wealth that can be garnered from it. And the problems that we have now would instantly go away if we partner in a healthy manner and we really focused on collaboration and not focused on individual efforts. Because 0.5% of 1% of the nation's wealth to 1.5%, that's nothing to celebrate. That's nothing to celebrate. And I would not, if you got an F in a class, do you think your parents would send you home and say, you know what, Shalise, we're going to celebrate? No, that's an F. And there's a lot of reasons why we get an F. We'll go in, that's not for this podcast. But some of it has to be on our shoulders as well, because we have institutional problems that barriers that kept Black people from owning property and voting, and there are a whole bunch of things that keep us from, moving the needle in the wealth gap. But there are a lot of things that we do. Just look in Gary at Playos Club. Look at what happened at the graduation in Gary. There's stuff that's self-inflicted that we need to focus on Juneteenth instead of cooking out.
Well, and that's what I was kind of getting at. I wasn't getting at individual successes. Right. I was getting at a time where we were community-based, more so community-based during those times. So that made me wonder how the statistic may have moved at that time, what the progression was. I think you're right. I think what has disappeared or what is diminished in our communities is community.
Yeah,
community
right.
itself.
Right. I agree.
There's no sense of community anymore, unfortunately. And how does that get reestablished? Well, using Juneteenth as a celebration of community is more than just here's one day there's some vendors here and food here and there, and then tomorrow, June 20th, we move on with our lives, or June 21st. Right. Back to the same old.
Right. Like I saw a statistic when we were getting ready for this podcast. In 2010, the 2010 U.S. Census, they said that there were 71% of Black women in America that were unmarried. That is unbelievable to me.
Well, that's a whole show within itself.
71%. And what are we? So your wealth gap is 1.5%. You're not marrying you're not marrying. So that means we already talked about that in another show, the Millionaire Next Door book, where it talks about most of your millionaires that accumulate wealth are partners. They are married. So we're not marrying. Our wealth gap is dismal. So what are we doing? What are we celebrating? What are we really, really doing? So, that's our businesses. What we own, 7% of the nation's businesses?
I would imagine so. I know it's probably under 10% for sure.
So that's that three-legged stool that I talked about. So let me ask you a question. And keeping with this podcast and talking about Juneteenth and celebrating it, how would you change it? Because it seems like you have a more optimistic view of celebrating it. And what if you had a crystal ball? What would the day look like?
Well, I think what you're getting at is more than just Juneteenth itself.
That's right.
So I think what you're getting at is the overall issue of what's happened in the deterioration of the Black community. And that's not just about, the celebration of Juneteenth. That's about coming together to strategize and figure out how our community got broken. And I think that in what I would do with Juneteenth, I wouldn't do away with the celebrations that are happening, on the one day, because I think that the history needs to be recognized. And that's the first step in getting the history recognized. I liken it to what happened with Martin Luther King's birthday. Getting that recognized was very important. So now the sleeves have to be rolled up and you go into the work of saying, now, why did we do all of this to get recognized? Well, what do we have going on in this area? And sometimes it is a section by section, a state by state, section by section, to model after what one community may have done to spread it across the country. But don't just make it about, the picnic, the bouncy house for the kids, and, tell the kids why you're going down there. Educating.
Right.
There's a huge education component that comes along with celebrating this day.
Yeah, I agree with you. And if I had a crystal ball, I would. I think there has to be a fun component to Juneteenth. So I don't want to leave viewers or listeners with the impression that it has to be all business and no play, because you do have to have some celebration. But I would probably lean more to the substantive delivery of information and strategy and planning. So I would have, and I know they do this in some places. I know, shout out to Karen Freeman Wilson, Chicago Urban League. They're doing some wonderful, great things with their Juneteenth celebration. And there are a lot of celebrations that talk about economic empowerment. So I don't want to leave the impression that this is not happening, but I would like to see it happen on a larger scale to really highlight some of the problems, particularly with love, redefining love. The whole point of this podcast is highlighting married people in business and really being a positive sphere and influence for folks. So I think we have to really focus on the redefining love in our communities, and not just between man and woman, but also how we treat our fellow brothers and sisters. So there's something tragically wrong when we can go into a nightclub and just shoot and take 3 people's lives, and that's okay. Or there's a situation where kids don't even feel safe, where they have to have a gun at a graduation. Those guys that were shooting at their graduation were graduating. I have a problem with that. So I think, I would be more on the substantive side on focusing on those institutional ills and trying to figure out a way to address them and deal with it in that nature.
Well, I mean, that's always going to be something that has to be dealt with, and it's not just going to happen on Juneteenth. So I think that, if it's a start on Juneteenth to say, okay, we've got the economic empowerment workshops going on, we've got the workshops going on as to what's happening in the criminal or the crime that's increasing in the area, what's happening where our kids don't feel safe, what's happening in the business arena where you can't have an entertainment venue without people being killed. That's not just one day. So you have to start it on, what I'm hearing you say, if you want to start it that day, then that's where you have, the other components outside of just here's the celebratory side. So, that's where I was getting at with the education component.
Right.
You get your community leaders, your people in place, that your business owners, and you got to start talking. And you can't let this be something that goes by the wayside.
And it has to be more than just Juneteenth. And I think you made that point very clear. Just like Black History Month. Black History Month should be something that is discussed year-round, because Black History Month, or Black history, is American history, and it's not just our history, it's everyone's history. And I view Juneteenth the same way. It just shouldn't be a holiday that we celebrate. It should be a holiday that everybody embraces. And it should be lofty goals and strategic measures that are discussed 365 days of the year and not just one day of the year.
I would agree with that. I do, however, think it has to start with us as African Americans.
I agree with that.
It takes me back to the question that we said at the top of the show. Why are we celebrating?
And that's a perfect way to end the segment. Perfect way to end the segment. Yeah. Well, that was good. I hope I was, I wasn't too hard on the holiday, because I really, as I criticize the holiday, I'm about to go grab some pizza and relax a little bit. But I did contribute. We do a lot of research when we do these shows, and Juneteenth is a great holiday, and I'm looking forward to more and more Juneteenth celebrations to discuss collaborations, to discuss love and partnerships and really just overall how to make our communities better. And I'm looking forward and embracing the challenge of not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. So
absolutely. That's what I was going to say. We just got to take action. So in taking that action, educate yourself about this holiday, about this event, and why it's so important for you to know what it means. And then what can you do after that?
Yeah, partner, collaborate, and just come together and do something special, which is what Married People's Business is all about. You want to close us out with where folks can follow us?
All right, so you can follow us on YouTube. You can find our podcast on streaming services such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Amazon Music. And don't forget to subscribe when you hit that link on YouTube. You watch us as we sit here because, you know, we like to be seen sometime. I'm kind of fancy today.
You are fancy. You are fancy. Married People's Business. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Take care.
God bless you.
All right.